All right, here's an example of our next exercise. And this one looks really pretty simple, and it's not real tough, but it's kind of different, right? Here, let me show you. So we've got these books all turning at different angles, and that's sort of the takeaway of the lesson. Okay, so in the last lesson, we did something like this here, right? And this has things turning at an angle, but it's only a right angle to us, where both sides go straight back to a vanishing point. I'll talk more about that in just a second. But we've been working up till this point, or very recently, with just 1 point perspective. And the thing about 1 point perspective is that it's just got that 1 point. Everything goes back to that point along the horizon line. So that's cool, whether it was like this one or this one, which is just so obvious. Everything going back to the horizon line. And it looks pretty darn natural, doesn't it? Okay, the problem is when we look at this one here in 2 point perspective, it looks a little bit fish-eyed or a little bit extreme, like the angle is a little extreme. Okay, well, there's a reason for that. All right. And the reason is that human beings have a certain field of vision. The paper that we have been using is pretty good. It's longer than it is wide, but the human's field of vision is more, it's almost 2 times as long as it is wide. And so if we wanted things to look a little bit more natural, and a little bit less extreme, right, we would have to actually move those vanishing points further out. So currently we have them at the sides here. We'd have to put them off of the paper, so to speak. So I'm going to talk about that first. Okay, so our paper is already kind of long and thin, as you know, as sort of aspect ratios go. Okay, but it could be longer and thinner. So if I was to take two of these guys, like this, right, we'd see that's how wide it has to be. Wider than it was originally. Okay. Well, okay. So what can I do about that? Well, one thing I could do is I could take two pieces of paper, make them wider than they were originally. Definitely wider there, I think, right? So if we took two pieces of paper here, we see, oh yes, definitely wider than two of them. Alrighty. So what I'll do to make things easy on me is I'll just take a little bit of tape. Just a little bit, tiny, tiny, tiny. A little bit here, right? I'll put it right up here. And I'll put a little bit right over here, right here. Nice and smooth. Okay. And when I go to shading things where this texture might really get in my way, I'll probably just remove the paper from this area. Okay. So what I could do is I could take a piece of paper, let's say like this one right here, for instance. And if I wanted to mount it onto here, I just go ahead and line it right up. There it is. And maybe just put a little other piece of tape just right here. I suppose if I was being really clever, I wouldn't even need those other ones underneath. But in any case, you'd want to remove this paper before shading because you would still get, let's say, a line in the paper. Okay, so I've just got that, and here, maybe one here and one here. Cool. And so let's say I was to draw my horizon line in a piece of paper like this. And right, there's my horizon line. I should probably draw a little darker, huh? Okay, darker just so you guys can see it. And then remember, I wanted to extend it past the lines of the paper, right? Past the bounds of the paper, I should say. So an easy way of doing this is just by taking two pieces of paper. Okay, and we'll get it about in the middle. Okay, that seems rather middle-ish. And I could just put a line here on the one side and a line here on the other. That's going to give me an aspect ratio, in other words, top to sides, of 2 to 1. Okay, and it's much more like human vision. Okay, human vision is slightly less, but not much. Okay, so good enough. So that's where I could put all my things. So these vanishing points are going to come in handy here in just a little bit. But let me show you another thing. Okay, so as I've just shown you here, vanishing points can sometimes be off the paper. And so to make something like these books right here, you won't necessarily see the vanishing points for these guys. You'll see some of them, but not others. Okay, back to that in a little bit. But first, let's see, how could we possibly deal with that? Okay, well, if I have a square like this here, right, and I was to go and just draw an X into it, you would see that I could find the center of the square, right? Here, I'm going to draw my lines a little bit darker so you guys can see them. Okay, so there's the center of my square. And if I was to go like this, draw it up, draw it down, draw it across, okay, and from this point to this point, right here, from this point to this point here, here, and here, you would see that I get another square. Look at that. Cool, right? That square is hopefully very visible to you. All right. Well, now watch this. If I were to turn this, so let's say I was to put a point, how is the best way to show this? Okay, if I was to draw a line here, and here, here, and here, and by the way, the only thing these lines are for is for me to get measurements, right? And say like, okay, well, instead of putting a point here and here and here, what if I was to put a point 1 over? So I'm going to put a point 1 over here. I'm going to put a point 1 over here. I'm going to put a point 1 over here. And I'm going to put a point 1 over here. You would see that once again, I am going to get a square. See how that worked? Now, of course, what I could do, I could just turn this at any certain amount of degrees and still keep getting squares. So what if I was to take this and divide that in half even further, right? And we're going to do the same thing over here, and the same thing over here, and the same thing over here. And once again, do that, do that, do that, and that. And finally this. Once again, I get a square, right? So they're different sizes, that's okay, but they're still all squares, right? Okay. Well, now this works in perspective as well. Let's see, give you the real deal. Okay, so there, now it's in perspective, right? Okay. That's in real life. We can do this in theory too, and that's how I get these books going into different directions, all different directions. Let me lay it out for you here. Okay, let's do it for realsies.